pho was divided before it conquered the world. French colonial appetites made beef more available in northern Vietnam, but French cooks did not simply invent the bowl. Vietnamese vendors combined that new meat economy with rice noodles, local broth, aromatics, and Chinese-influenced street commerce. Then, war cut the country in two. Northern refugees carried pho south in 1954, where the broth changed and the garnish plate grew. After 1975, another refugee exodus carried those southern bowls overseas. The soup, now called timeless, was rebuilt at every rupture: colonization, partition, war, and exile by people trying to make a living and a home. Pho feels ancient because its components are older than the dish. Vietnamese communities had cultivated rice for centuries. Flat rice noodles belong to a much wider East and Southeast Asian noodle world. Cooks made broths, charred aromatics, used fish sauce, and balanced fresh herbs long before anyone wrote the word fish. Chinese migrants and merchants also shaped northern cities. Southern Chinese foodways included rice noodles and beef noodle soups. Markets, docks, mines, mills, and construction sites created customers who needed hot food away from home. Vietnamese rural dishes add another possible ancestor. Accounts often point to XO True, a broth with slices of water buffalo served with rice vermicelli or noodles. Water buffalo and cattle were valuable working animals. They pulled plows, moved loads, and represented agricultural capital. Killing one for ordinary beef consumption could make little economic sense. These older foods establish possibility, not a single birth certificate. If every broth containing noodles and meat counts as pho, then pho has no useful history. The modern dish becomes visible only when a new urban economy brings particular noodles, beef, broth, vendors, and customers together. That convergence occurred in northern Vietnam around the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Nam Dinh Province is commonly described as a cradle. Hanoi became the city where mobile vendors and shops made the food famous. Nam Dinh contained villages with professional cooking lineages and a major textile economy. Workers and migrants moved between the province and Hanoi. A recipe could therefore develop through a network rather than appear at one address. Textile factories sharpened the urban logic. Industrial workers needed meals around shifts, not only at the household schedule. A hot bowl supplied starch, liquid, salt, and a small amount of meat in one fast purchase. Vendors could follow labor toward factory gates and transport routes. Noodle production created its own chain. Rice was soaked, milled into batter, steamed into sheets, cooled, and cut. The finished B&H phi had to remain supple without dissolving when broth hit it. The bowl that appeared in a minute rested on hours of work by millers, noodle makers, fuel sellers, butchers, and cooks. The earliest documentation is frustratingly late. A detailed 1907 account of Vietnamese food did not clearly include pho, while literary and remembered references place vendors in the 1910s. By the 1930s, dictionaries and international cookbooks could define the soup. That timing makes one fact clear. Pho is not an ancient survival untouched by modern history. It is a modern Vietnamese food born during colonial rule. France consolidated colonial control over Vietnam in the late 19th century as part of French Indochina. Colonial rule reorganized land, taxes, infrastructure, cities, labor, and consumption around unequal power. French residents wanted beef. Their demand encouraged slaughter and distribution systems different from the older agricultural value of working cattle and buffalo. Colonial cities created restaurants, military kitchens, butcher shops, households, and institutions serving European diets. Colonial urban space separated people while forcing contact. European quarters advertised sanitation, order, and privilege. Vietnamese commercial streets supplied labor and services. Markets linked both worlds even when law and custom ranked their residents differently. Food moved across boundaries more easily than political equality. The butcher shop was one point of contact. A carcass could feed a French dining room and a Vietnamese street stall without making the two customers equal participants in exchange. They bought different cuts at different prices, and occupied different positions in the system that produced them. When an animal is butchered, status sorts the carcass. Wealthier customers can purchase desirable cuts. Bones, tendons, tough meat, and offal acquire another price and another market. Local cooks can turn low-status parts into concentrated broth through time and skill. This is the material French influence on pho. Colonial appetites changed how much beef entered northern markets and what parts became available to vendors. But the phrase French influence can hide the violence of the system. Vietnamese people paid taxes, supplied labor, lost political power, and faced racial hierarchy. The availability of a beef bone was not a gift from France. It was a byproduct of an economy designed around colonizers' privilege. Vietnamese and Chinese vendors recognized value in what that economy undervalued. Bones could simmer with ginger, onion or shallot, fish sauce, and warm aromatics. Rice noodles extended the portion. Thin slices of meat cooked quickly in hot broth. Long simmering converted time into value. Collagen gave broth body. Charring aromatics created sweetness and depth without expensive ingredients. Skimming protected clarity. Toasted spices contributed fragrance powerful enough to travel into the street. These choices were culinary knowledge, not an automatic consequence of possessing bones. The broth also redistributed the animal. One cauldron could flavor many servings. A customer who could not buy a steak could still taste beef. Colonial inequality created the price hierarchy. Street cooking found a way to work within it. The resulting bowl answered a colonial city without belonging to the colonizer. It was affordable enough for workers, portable as a business, and tailored to local taste. This is the difference between conditions and authorship. Colonialism altered the animal and the market. Local cooks authored the response. The most famous origin story connects pho to pot au feu, the French boiled beef dish whose name means pot on the fire. The resemblance is seductive. Both use beef and prolonged simmering. The final syllable of the French name can sound somewhat like to foreign ears. A steaming street cauldron even offers a literal pot over fire. But resemblance is not proof. Pot au feu usually arrives as meat and vegetables with broth, not rice noodles assembled to order with fish sauce and Vietnamese aromatics. The sound change is debated. Other scholars connect the word phi to Chinese terms for rice noodles or beef noodles. Early spellings and street cries support several interpretations. The argument matters because etymology can become a claim of ownership. If phi comes from phew, the story can quietly turn French colonialism into creative instruction. Europeans bring beef, technique, and even the name. Vietnamese people merely imitate. Historian Erica Peters warns that such stories can erase local improvisation and ethnic complexity. Chinese vendors disappear. Vietnamese street cooks disappear. The colonial economy becomes a generous culinary exchange rather than a hierarchy people had to survive. The safest conclusion is layered. French beef consumption likely helped create the market conditions. French stews may have supplied an influence. Chinese-associated noodles, commerce, and terminology mattered. Vietnamese broth traditions, seasoning, service, and customers made the dish what it became. Even the spice cabinet refuses a simple flag. Star anise, cassia, clove, and cardamom traveled through Asian trade and medicine. Fish sauce had deep regional histories. Ginger and onion crossed cuisines without belonging to one national owner. A cook selected proportions that customers in Hanoi recognized as a coherent bowl. This is how cuisine usually forms, not by collecting one ingredient per country, but by turning available materials into a repeatable local relationship. Pho's Vietnamese identity lies in that relationship. No one influence is a complete recipe, and no archive names one inventor whose claim resolves Nam Dinh against Hanoi. Pho's origin is strongest as a convergence produced under pressure. The people who made that convergence visible carried their kitchens through the street. Early pho was a feat of mobile engineering. A NHV vendor balanced two loads from a bamboo shoulder pole. One side carried a cauldron of broth kept hot over charcoal or wood. The other held bowls, chopsticks, noodles, sliced meat, herbs, seasonings, and space to assemble an order. The system placed a restaurant on one body. Balance was literal. Too much weight on one side strained the carrier and destabilized hot liquid. Fuel had to keep broth safe and steaming without consuming the day's profit. Breakable bowls traveled over uneven streets. Water for washing and preparation remained limited. Vendors worked around the rhythms of colonial Hanoi, dawn labor, markets, offices, tram stops, and evening crowds. Their call advertised the food before a customer saw the pot. Steam and aroma turned the street into a dining room. Each sale had to recover several clocks. Broth consumed fuel for hours before dawn. Fresh noodles and herbs had a short life. Meat tied up cash. Ceramic bowls could break. If the vendor carried too much, the load became dangerous. Too little, and an early sellout wasted demand. Credit and trust helped the system function. A butcher, noodle maker, or fuel seller might know the vendor as a repeat customer. Diners learned which call promised a clear broth or generous slice. Reputation was an asset that could not be carried in either basket but determined the value of both. Urbanization created opportunity and regulation. Mobile sellers could reach workers who could not afford formal restaurants, but they occupied public space controlled by colonial authorities. Police, sanitation rules, fees, weather, and harassment could determine whether a day ended with income. Nam Dinh cooks helped build a reputation in Hanoi. By the 1920s and 1930s, fixed shops increasingly joined or replaced mobile vendors. A shop protected the cauldron and offered seats, but added rent and made location permanent. The bowl itself required invisible hours. Bones were cleaned, blanched, and simmered. Foam and fat were managed to keep broth clear. Onion and ginger were charred. Spices had to perfume rather than dominate. Noodles were portioned. Meat was sliced thin enough for speed. Pho became famous not because it was simple, but because vendors made complexity look immediate. The carrying pole is the missing machine in most origin stories. It explains how a new dish reached enough people to become a city habit. Colonial Hanoi did not remain stable long enough for pho to become timeless. During the Second World War, Japanese forces occupied Indochina while the French colonial administration continued under Vichy authority for much of the period. Requisition, crop failure, transport disruption, and policy contributed to the catastrophic famine of 1944 and 1945 in northern Vietnam. At least hundreds of thousands died, many estimates reach 1 million or more. People stripped fields, searched markets, sold possessions, left villages, and died along roads. Rice moved through a political economy in which military demand and broken transport could matter more than local hunger. Any food history that jumps from colonial origins to a charming bowl erases the catastrophe surrounding its survival. Against that catastrophe, a bowl of beef broth could not be ordinary. Meat availability changed. Vendors substituted, reduced portions, or disappeared. Chicken pho had appeared by the late 1930s and became another durable branch, though later stories disagree about the exact market restrictions that encouraged it. In 1945, revolution ended the old political order, but not conflict. Ho Chi Minh declared independence. France attempted to restore colonial control. The First Indochina War continued until the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Hanoi changed hands and political meanings. Vendors navigated curfews, military presence, disrupted supply, and ideological suspicion toward private commerce. A shop could be a workplace, gathering point, and symbol of the urban life different regimes claim to represent. Chicken pho demonstrates adaptation without a clean origin date. Chicken required a different broth, fat, aroma, and cutting practice. It was not merely beef pho with the meat swapped at the last moment. Cooks had to construct another balance while keeping the name recognizable. Food moved through inflation, rationing, military zones, and competing governments. Pho could appear as bourgeois indulgence, worker nourishment, urban normality, or national culture depending on who described it. The broth also became a measure of absence. Less meat could mean more attention to bone, char, fish sauce, or spice. Scarcity did not automatically improve the recipe. It forced cooks to protect flavor with fewer resources. War is often used as exciting background for food history. Here it must remain material. People were killed, displaced, conscripted, imprisoned, and impoverished. The dish survived because daily commerce continued inside that danger, not because violence somehow made cuisine more creative. In 1954, the Geneva Settlement temporarily divided Vietnam near the 17th parallel. The political line divided Pho too. After Geneva, hundreds of thousands of people moved from the north to the south, many of them Catholics and others fearing or rejecting rule by the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Smaller numbers moved in the other direction. Governments and foreign powers organized transport while using the migration for political propaganda. Northern families carried pho to Saigon and other southern cities. The soup had existed beyond the north before 1954, but migration dramatically expanded its presence and professional knowledge. Resettlement was not one voluntary culinary tour. Families abandoned property, graves, businesses, and neighborhood networks. Many depended on government, military, religious, or foreign assistance. A cook arriving with skill still needed a pot, fuel, ingredients, a legal place to sell, and customers. Food businesses could rebuild social networks. People from the same northern town shared information and labor. A shop name might preserve a place that the owner could not safely revisit. Eating there let customers recognize accent, taste, and memory inside an unfamiliar southern city. The new environment changed the bowl. Southern markets offered different herbs and a different urban audience. Bean sprouts, Thai basil, culantro, lime, fresh chile, and sauces could appear beside the bowl. Broths often became sweeter or more heavily seasoned. Portions and meat choices expanded. Saigon was also receiving American money, military personnel, rural migrants, and people displaced by expanding war. Its restaurants served a population growing faster than stable housing and infrastructure. Pho had to work as breakfast, late meal, quick service, and regional signal all at once. Condiments let a vendor accommodate difference without maintaining several broths. One customer could add chile and lime, another could leave the bowl untouched. The garnish plate was therefore not only abundance, it was a service technology for a diverse city. These are tendencies, not laws. Not every Hanoi bowl is austere. Not every Saigon bowl is sweet or buried in herbs. Shops, families, prices, and generations produce more variation than the north-south binary allows. Still, garnish service expresses a real difference in philosophy. A northern vendor may present a bowl as already complete, with scallion, onion, herbs, chill, or vinegar offered in controlled ways. A southern table can give the eater a larger set of raw materials to rebuild the bowl. That abundance reflected ecology and commerce, but it also reflected migration. Refugees preserve memory selectively. Some features become stricter because they represent a lost home. Others change quickly because a business must satisfy new customers. Saigon's pho, therefore, was not a corrupted northern original. It was a refugee and regional cuisine developing under the Republic of Vietnam, American intervention, rapid urban growth, and escalating war. The 1954 movement created a second major life for the dish. The fall of Saigon in 1975 created a third. The war, commonly called the Vietnam War in the United States and the American War in Vietnam, ended with the fall of Saigon in April 1975. People connected to the South Vietnamese government, U.S. institutions, the military, and other vulnerable groups fled. Later waves escaped by sea or through neighboring countries, endured camps, and resettled across the United States, France, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere. They did not leave as culinary ambassadors executing a national plan. They left because defeat, persecution, re-education, economic hardship, and fear made home dangerous or impossible. Restaurants became one path through exile. Credentials did not always transfer. Language and discrimination narrowed employment. A family could convert cooking knowledge and pooled labor into a business that served both Vietnamese customers and unfamiliar neighbors. The business demanded translation. Menus needed Roman letters without Vietnamese diacritics that early printers could not easily produce. Servers explained raw beef that cooked in broth, unfamiliar cuts such as tendon and tripe, and herbs diners had never handled. Mispronunciation could become the price of recognition. Family labor compressed costs. Children translated forms, answered phones, and worked after school. Adults cooked through long shifts while managing remittances and news from relatives. A restaurant that looked like entrepreneurial success could also reveal how refugee families absorbed risks that larger institutions would not. Pho was uniquely suited to that work. One broth system could support several cuts and price levels. The name was short enough to place on a sign. Aroma and visible assembly helped explain the food without fluent English or French. But ingredients had to be found again. The right noodles, herbs, bones, fish sauce, and spices were not equally available in every resettlement city. Suppliers grew alongside communities. Substitutions became habits. Portions changed. The Southern garnish plate traveled widely because many post-1975 refugees had lived in the South, including Northern families transformed by the 1954 migration. This created a layered refugee route, north to south after 1954, then south to overseas after 1975. A bowl in California could carry a Hanoi family memory that had already spent 20 years becoming Saigonese. Calling it simply Northern or Southern could miss the biography inside it. Local conditions added another layer. American beef cuts, restaurant regulation, refrigerator space, suburban shopping centers, and customer expectations changed production. Large bowls and abundant meat could signal value in a market where rent and competition demanded a visible bargain. A restaurant also became a communication network. Customers exchanged news, jobs, housing leads, political arguments, and information about relatives. A bowl could hold memory of Hanoi, Nam Dinh, Saigon, a refugee camp, or a first American storefront at the same table. By the 1990s and 2000s, pho moved beyond Vietnamese neighborhoods. Non-Vietnamese diners learned to pronounce it, often imperfectly. Chains and supermarkets sold simplified versions. Celebrity chefs treated it as a technique to borrow. The world called this globalization. For refugee families, it began as reconstruction. Pho now carries several authenticity battles at once. Nam Dinh and Hanoi can argue over birthplace. Northern and Southern eaters can argue over sugar, herbs, sprouts, sauces, and whether additions bury the broth. Diaspora cooks can be accused of Americanizing portions. Foreign chefs can turn pho into a cocktail, sandwich, or fine dining concept and call the result innovation. These arguments are not trivial. They concern who has authority to represent Vietnam after colonialism divided its society, war divided its territory, and migration scattered its people. But purity cannot settle the history. The earliest modern bowl was already mixed, rice noodles connected to a regional and Chinese-influenced food world, beef made newly available through colonial appetite, Vietnamese aromatics and fish sauce, and street labor adapting all of it to northern cities. French influence is real. French ownership is not. Chinese influence is real. That does not make pho less Vietnamese. Southern change is real. It does not make Saigon's bowl a failed copy. Diaspora adaptation is real. It does not cancel the refugee memory inside the restaurant. Pho became a national dish not by escaping history, but by absorbing it. Colonial hierarchy changed the meat. Vietnamese vendors changed the scraps into commerce. Revolution and famine changed availability. The 1954 partition changed geography and garnish. The war ending in 1975 created exile. Refugees changed a regional food into a global language. Inside Vietnam, reunification did not erase regional difference. Post-war shortages and state economic controls shaped restaurant life. The market reforms known as I-Me, beginning in 1986, expanded private commerce and changed the possibilities for shops. Tourism later turned pho into heritage, brand, and national welcome. Official celebration can preserve knowledge, but it can also smooth conflict into one patriotic story. Recognizing Hanoi and Nam Dinh traditions does not settle every origin dispute. Promoting pho as national culture should not erase the Southern and refugee transformations that made the dish globally recognizable. None of this makes colonialism or war a gift. Both destroyed lives and constrained choices. The achievement belongs to the people who made nourishment and community inside those constraints. Listen to a bowl being assembled. Noodles drop. Meat lands. Broth rises. Herbs release their aroma. The movement is fast because the history was slow. Pho was shaped by foreign power and war. It was made Vietnamese by the cooks who refused to let either have the final word.